Number 3. The murder of Stephen Lawrence. It's believed that double jeopardy first became law in England sometime between 1164 and 1170 during the reign of King Henry II. For 850 years, that law would remain a pillar of the English legal system. But that all changed in 2006 because of a barbaric crime that happened 13 years earlier on the night of April 22, 1993. 18-year-old Stephen Lawrence had spent the evening playing video games at a friend's home in South London. Lawrence's parents had immigrated to England from Jamaica in the 1960s. Lawrence and his 2 younger siblings were born and raised in South London. His mother worked as a teacher for children with special needs, and his father was a carpenter. In 1993, Lawrence was studying physics and technology in college. At around 10 p.m. on April 22nd, Lawrence and his friend, Dwayne Brooks, went to catch a bus to go home. There were 2 buses that they could have taken, and the stops for the buses were on different streets that were close to each other. Lawrence stood on one street and watched for one bus, and Brooks stood on a different road and kept an eye out for the other bus. Whatever bus came first, they would hop on it and head home. Suddenly and completely unprovoked, Lawrence was swarmed by 5 or 6 young white men. Brooks saw the attack, and he heard one of the young men use a racial slur just before they jumped Lawrence. Lawrence tried to run away, but he only got 130 yards, and then he fell to the ground. He had been stabbed in the front, right above his right collarbone, and he had been stabbed in the back as well, in the left shoulder. Both wounds were about 5 inches deep. Lawrence was rushed to the hospital, but sadly, he was pronounced dead on arrival. The next day, the police received a phone call from an unidentified man. He told them that there was a note for them in a garbage can in a parking lot of a pub. The police found the letter, and it gave the name of 4 men: Neil Acortt, Dave Norris, Jamie Acortt, and Gary Dobson. The note then indicated that the 4 men were involved in Lawrence's stabbing. The writer then goes on to say that he thought Neil Acortt and Dave Norris were involved in 2 other racially motivated stabbings. The remainder of the letter said, "All know how to use and carry knives openly. They must be stopped as they are very dangerous beings. This is not a BMP-related incident. Approach with care. It's down to you to prove it. You will come up trumps." Name 1, which is referring to Neil Acortt, was seen in the area of the stabbing, plus other lads not quite identified, as was dark. Not sure what one stabbed that poor lad. We'll find killer if you arrest these. Good luck. The note was unsigned. When the police arrived at the parking lot, they saw a young man running away from the scene. Officers tried to run after him, but they couldn't catch him. The police then put the 4 young men named in the note under surveillance. 12 days later, no arrests had been made, and Lawrence's family spoke out in the media, accusing the police of dragging their feet. 2 days after that, Lawrence's parents met with the president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela. Several days later, and over the next month, the police made 5 arrests in connection with Lawrence's murder. This included the 4 men named in the note: Dave Norris, Gary Dobson, and Neil and Jamie Acortt, who were brothers. The 5th man was a friend of the 4 men named Luke Knight. After their arrest, Lawrence's friend, Dwayne Brooks, picked 2 of the men out of a lineup, Neil Acortt and Luke Knight. Both Neil and Knight were charged with murder. But a month later, the charges were dropped because the Crown Prosecution Service did not think that Brooks's witness testimony was reliable. In December 1993, about 5 months after the charges were dropped, a lawyer for the Lawrence family said they had amazing new evidence. The evidence supposedly identified 3 suspects. When this announcement was made, the inquest into Lawrence's murder was stopped. The family's lawyer gave the evidence to the Crown Prosecution Service, and they reviewed it. 4 months later, the Crown Prosecution Service said that the evidence wasn't strong enough to prosecute anyone, so no charges were filed. In September 1994, the family launched a private prosecution, which is an uncommon criminal proceeding. In fact, it was the first time that a murder case was going to be privately prosecuted in modern England. In most trials, the prosecutor is a public employee who works for the state. For example, in the United States, most criminal cases are prosecuted by the district attorney, which is an employee of the state. In a private prosecution, individuals or corporations hire a private lawyer or lawyers, and the private lawyer prosecutes the case in place of a public prosecutor. A private prosecution was a risky move by the Lawrence family for a few reasons. The first is that the family would not receive any legal aid, and they would have to pay all the expenses themselves. This included the prosecution lawyer's fees, lab tests, experts' fees, and any other expenses involved in a criminal case. If they lost the case and the men were acquitted, they would have to pay their legal fees. They could also face a malicious prosecution lawsuit. Finally, if the men were acquitted, they couldn't be retried because that would be double jeopardy. Before the private prosecution went to trial, in December 1994, the police had the 5 suspects under surveillance. They recorded Gary Dobson, Luke Knight, and Neil Acord using racist and violent language. In April 1996, about a year and a half after it was first announced, 3 of the suspects, Gary Dobson, Luke Knight, and Neil Acord, went to trial to face private prosecution. At the trial, the judge ruled that Dwayne Brooks' witness evidence was not admissible. This rocked the foundation of the case, and the 3 men were acquitted. After the trial, the inquest into Lawrence's murder was restarted. The lead investigator of the inquest wanted to talk to the 5 suspects, but they refused to cooperate. In February 1997, about 10 months after the private prosecution, the inquest released its findings. It concluded what most people already thought, that Lawrence was killed in an unprovoked racist attack. The day after the inquest was made public, the tabloid, the Daily Mail, named the 5 suspects publicly and showed a photograph of each of them on the cover. In the caption, they encouraged the men to sue them if they were wrong. In March 1997, the Police Complaints Authority announced that after a review, they saw no problems of racism in the Metropolitan Police Department when it came to the investigation of Stephen Lawrence's murder. But then 4 months later, an inquiry was launched that would help the police when dealing with racially motivated crimes in the future. 8 months later, in March 1998, the 5 suspects were ordered to testify at the public inquiry or they would face prosecution. The 5 young men did testify, but they were evasive in their answers. As they were being escorted from the building after testifying, protesters threw eggs and bottles at them. The police ended up using tear gas on the protesters. Months later, in October 1998, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Paul Condon, testified at the inquiry. He admitted that there were failures in the investigation, and he apologized to the Lawrence family for letting them down. In February 1999, the findings of the inquiry were released. The report said that the police department was guilty of institutional racism and it made 70 recommendations. One of those recommendations was to change the double jeopardy law. The report said that new prosecutions should be allowed where fresh and viable evidence is presented. In September 2002, Dave Norris and Neil Acorn were convicted and sentenced to 18 months for an attack on a black off-duty police officer that occurred in 2001. They had thrown a drink at him after yelling a racial slur. About 2 years later, in May 2004, the Queen Prosecution Service announced that they didn't think that anyone would be charged with Stephen Lawrence's murder. They announced this even though a year earlier, there had been a massive change to the English legal system. The changes were part of the Criminal Justice Act 2003. Part of the act was a major change to the double jeopardy law. The Court of Appeal was given the ability to quash an acquittal in order to retrial if new and compelling evidence was found. Even though in May 2004, the Queen Prosecution Service said that no one would probably face charges in Stephen Lawrence's murder, in November 2007 the police announced that they were examining evidence from the case for DNA. But in the years after the announcement, no arrests were made. Then in July 2010, one of the men who was tried and acquitted of Lawrence's murder in the private prosecution, Gary Dobson, was convicted of dealing drugs, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Less than a year later, in May 2011, thanks to the change in the double jeopardy law, Dobson's acquittal from the private prosecution was quashed. That meant that even though he had already been found not guilty, he could face retrial. And that is exactly what happened. In November of that year, Gary Dobson and Dave Norris, who was in charge of the private prosecution, went to trial for the murder of Stephen Lawrence. At the trial, the Queen Prosecution Service revealed that DNA from both men were found on Lawrence's clothes. In January 2002, 18 years after 18-year-old Stephen Lawrence was killed, Gary Dobson and Dave Norris were both found guilty. They were both given life sentences. Dobson will have to serve a minimum of 15 years and 2 months, and Norris will have to spend a minimum of 14 years and 3 months in prison. In May 2018, one of the men accused of being involved in the attack on Stephen Lawrence, Neil Acorn, was arrested in Spain on drug charges. He is accused of being the head of a massive marijuana trafficking ring. His brother, Jamie Acorn, who was also accused of being involved in Lawrence's murder, is wanted for his part in the drug ring. It's suspected that he's currently hiding out somewhere in Spain. The police have not said if they expect more charges to be laid in the murder of 18-year-old Stephen Lawrence. Number 2. The death of Mario Guzzetti. Philip Leung was born in 1960 in Guangdong Province, China. He had 4 sisters, and his father left the family when Leung was young to work in Hong Kong. After moving to Hong Kong, his father never came back. When Leung was in his preteens, his mother died from a stroke. After his mother's death, Leung made several attempts to cross the Shenzhen River to get into Hong Kong to meet up with his father. He was caught several times and he was shipped back home. He was 14 when he finally did make it into Hong Kong and he was able to find his father. But his father was a stranger to him and he never felt an emotional connection with him. In 1984, Leung went to New Zealand where he carved jade. 4 years later, he moved to Australia and he earned a certificate in jewelry design and manufacture. In 2001, about 13 years after he moved to Australia, Leung, who was 41, attended an opera function. It was there that he met 66-year-old Mario Guzzetti, who was a retired printer. They started a romantic relationship, and 2 years later, they moved in together. Then they ended up buying a house together in Alexandria, New South Wales. On the night of April 6, 2006, which was Good Friday, Leung and Guzzetti got into a minor argument about someone who was doing some tiling in their home. The next morning, Leung got up and made some carrot juice in a juicer for him and Guzzetti. Supposedly, sometime between 8:15 and 8:30, a neighbor heard a loud crash that sounded like a shell falling or pots clanging on the floor. This was followed by the sound of loud crying and screaming. At 9:12, a call came in to the emergency line. It was Philip Leung. He said, "I had a fight with my friend. Now my friend is dead." About 3 minutes later, first responders found Leung and Guzzetti at the bottom of the stairs in their home. Guzzetti was bleeding from the head, and Leung was resting his head in his lap. When the paramedics got there, 71-year-old Guzzetti wasn't breathing, and he was pronounced dead not long afterward. Leung told the police that morning he got up and he made carrot juice. He said that Guzzetti kept hassling him about the fight the night before. Then Guzzetti went to walk down the stairs, and he fell, which caused his death. The police didn't believe his story. Near the bottom of the stairs, about 3 feet from Guzzetti's body, the police found the juicer, and it had blood on it. They thought that Leung and Guzzetti got into a fight, and Leung hit Guzzetti 3 times in the head with the juicer, and this is what made him fall down the stairs. Leung then waited until Guzzetti was dead to call for help. An autopsy was conducted, but the results were inconclusive. Guzzetti had suffered an injury to his neck and blunt force injuries to the head. The medical examiner couldn't say with any certainty what caused the head injuries. He said they could have been caused by the juicer or the fall down the stairs. The medical examiner also found bruising and torn skin that were consistent with a fall down the stairs. The autopsy revealed that Guzzetti was not in the best of health before he died. The 71-year-old man had hypertension, his liver had scarring, there was fluid on his lungs, he had an enlarged heart, and 3 partially blocked arteries. Leung said that he also had high blood pressure. Leung suggested that something went wrong with Guzzetti's heart, or he may have became dizzy on the stairs, and that's why he fell down the stairs. Even though the autopsy report couldn't determine if Guzzetti's death was a murder or an accident, the police charged Leung with murder. In April 2009, Leung went to trial for murder, but he could have also been found guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. The prosecution presented their case first. Their evidence that Leung killed Guzzetti was that Leung waited an hour to call for help, and the bloody juicer found at the bottom of the stairs. The blood on the juicer was tested, and it belonged to Guzzetti. The juicer was also checked for fingerprints, and they found Leung's fingerprints on it. The prosecution said that this all proved that Leung hit Guzzetti with the juicer, and then he waited till he was dead to call for help. After hearing the prosecution's case, the judge directed the jury to acquit Leung of both murder and manslaughter because the prosecution had not proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge said that the juicer belonged to Leung, and he admitted to using it the morning that Guzzetti died, so it shouldn't be a surprise that his fingerprints were on it. Also, the prosecution could not conclusively prove that the juicer was used as a weapon. He noted that Guzzetti may have been carrying it when he fell down the stairs. The jury followed the judge's directions, and they found Luring not guilty of murder and manslaughter. Philip Luring walked out of court a free man. In 2006, there was a major change to the double jeopardy law in New South Wales. Acquittals can now be appealed and quashed. So the prosecutors appealed Luring's acquittal on the charge of manslaughter. They argue that the judge overstepped in his ruling by directing the jury to acquit on manslaughter because that wasn't the focus of the prosecution's case. The prosecution was trying to prove that he committed murder. The appeals court found the argument persuasive, and in October 2009, Luring's acquittal for manslaughter was overturned. After it was overturned, Luring was charged with manslaughter. Luring's case was the first time that someone had their acquittal overturned on appeal since the new law was passed. In April 2011, Luring went to trial again. No new evidence was presented at the trial. Just like at his first trial, the judge directed the jury to acquit after the prosecution presented their case. The judge said that there was not enough evidence to prove that Luring assaulted Guzzetti before he fell down the stairs. Once again, Luring walked out of court a free man, being the first man in Australian history to be acquitted twice over the same death. But Luring's legal problems were far from over. The prosecution filed yet another appeal. The new double jeopardy law said that one way an acquittal could be overturned if there was fresh and compelling evidence of guilt. The prosecution's new evidence was a statement from the medical examiner who performed the original autopsy. After the two trials, the medical examiner was taken to the house where Luring and Guzzetti lived, and he examined the staircase that Guzzetti supposedly fell down. After examining the staircase, he said that at best, it was only theoretically possible that Guzzetti's death was solely caused by a fall down the stairs. The Court of Appeals thought that the statement was compelling enough, and in March 2012, Luring's acquittal for manslaughter was quashed for a second time. Once again, Philip Luring was charged with manslaughter. After he was charged, he had to report to a police station once a week. The 5 years of legal trouble had wreaked havoc on his emotional health. He had to start seeing a psychiatrist, and he began taking antidepressants. In November 2012, Luring went to trial for a third time for the death of his partner. Absolutely no new physical evidence was presented at this trial. This time, the judge did not direct the jury to acquit. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They returned a verdict of guilty to manslaughter. Luring was sentenced to the minimum, which was 4.5 years in prison. Life in prison was difficult for Luring. He had to be transferred to different prisons several times because other inmates had gotten violent with him because of his sexual orientation. Then on December 22, 2012, just 2 years into his sentence, his lawyer arrived at the prison. His lawyer had good news. He had filed an appeal, and the majority of judges who ruled on it found in his favor. They said that the prosecution did not present sufficient evidence to convict Luring beyond a reasonable doubt. Specifically, they said that there was not enough evidence to show that the juicer was used as a weapon. They also said that none of the evidence excluded a fall down the stairs as the cause of death. Luring was released from prison later that same day. Philip Luring is the only man in Australia's history to go to trial 3 times for the death of one person. Many people were critical of the prosecution and the courts for using the changes to the double jeopardy law to harass Leung. They strongly believe that some of the decisions that were made were the result of institutional prejudice. Number 1. The murder of Jeremy Guillory. Jeremy Guillory was the only son of a single mother named Lorelei. In February 1992, Jeremy and his mother lived in Iowa, Louisiana, and he was 6 years old. On February 7th, he attended school, and then he came back home and had a snack. After he was done eating, he asked his mom if he could go out and play with his BB gun. She said yes, and she handed him the BB gun. A few hours later, Jeremy had not returned home, so Lorelei became worried. She looked up and down their street for him. She thought he must have gotten lost in the woods at the end of the road. She looked in the woods but couldn't find him, so she called the fire department from a neighbor's home. About 15 minutes later, that same neighbor called the police department and told them that a boy was lost. The police, the fire department, and the people in the neighborhood searched for Jeremy throughout the night, but no trace of him was found. After Jeremy had been missing for 3 days, several people told the police that a man named Ricky Langley might have been involved in his disappearance. When Lorelei called the fire department, she called from the home where Ricky was renting a room. Ricky was also the neighbor who called the police a few minutes after Lorelei called the fire department. The police read Ricky's records, and they were disturbed by what they found. About a year and a half before Ricky was born, his father, Alcide, lost his job at an auto plant in Los Angeles, California. Without any other job prospects, Alcide and his wife, Bessie, decided to move back to Louisiana. Alcide grew up in Louisiana, but Bessie had just moved there before she and Alcide got married. When they got married, Alcide was 17 and Bessie was 16. So one day in the summer of 1964, they loaded their 5 kids, who were under the age of 6, into the car and started the drive from Los Angeles to Louisiana. 7 hours later, they were in Arizona, and they were involved in a horrific single-car crash. Elsie and Bessie's eldest child and only son, Oscar, who was 5, and their infant daughter, were both killed in the crash. Bessie was thrown from the car, and she was in a coma for several days. When she came out of the coma, she was placed into a full body cast. She spent several months in the hospital, then around Christmas she was sent home, but she was still in her full body cast. In her body cast, she lost half her body weight. She was also on a steady diet of pain pills and drugs that were supposed to kill infections. But Bessie said the pain pills didn't work, so she drank whiskey to help with the pain. 5 months after Christmas, Bessie's doctors were amazed to learn that even though she was wearing a full body cast, she had gotten pregnant. The doctors highly encouraged her not to carry the baby to term. During the 5 months that she was pregnant, she was drinking alcohol, and she was on drugs that a pregnant woman should not have been taking. But Bessie didn't take the doctor's advice. On September 11th, 1965, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy, whom they named Ricky. 4 years later, Alcide and his brother-in-law built a 4-room house for the family in Iowa. As Ricky grew up, many people noticed his odd behavior. Notably, he was obsessed with his dead brother Oscar, but very little was done regarding him getting professional help. When Ricky was 19, he was arrested for sexually assaulting a young boy. but he wasn't sent to jail for the offense. Instead, he was given outpatient therapy. In the spring of 1986, after he completed his treatment, Ricky, who was 20, moved to Georgia. Not long afterward, Ricky was arrested and he pleaded guilty to sexually assaulting another boy. This time, he was sent to prison. While he was in prison, he was a model inmate. This led to him getting paroled in September 1990, less than 4 years after he was convicted. Shortly after he was released, he violated his parole and he moved back to Iowa. He lived in a rundown motel and he worked as a maintenance man at a gas station. During this time, he befriended a woman named Pearl Lawrence, who worked at the same gas station and lived at the same motel with her husband and 2 children. Pearl came up with a plan to rent a house where she and her family could live, and Ricky could rent a room from them. When Pearl and her husband were at work, Ricky could babysit their kids. Pearl knew that Ricky had been convicted of sex crimes involving children, but she thought she could trust him. So they moved into a house on the same street where Jeremy and his mother lived. Jeremy would play with Pearl's son and daughter. After several people identified Ricky as a possible suspect, the police went to the house where Ricky lived and arrested him for violating his parole. Once he was in the backseat of the police car, a detective read him his Miranda rights. Then Ricky blurted out a confession. He told the officer that Jeremy's body was in his closet. He led the police into his room and showed them the body. Ricky was taken to the police station and he gave a full confession. He said that Jeremy came by looking for Pearl's children, but the family was out. Ricky said he convinced Jeremy to come inside and wait for them. Once he was inside, he sexually assaulted and then strangled Jeremy. To make sure he was dead, he placed a sock over his airways. Once Ricky was sure he was dead, he put his body and his BB gun into his closet. Ricky admitted that he knew what he did was wrong, but he couldn't help himself. 10 days later, he was indicted for first-degree murder. He went to trial in June 1994, nearly 2.5 years after the murder. He pleaded not guilty and not guilty by reason of insanity. Ricky's confessions and a videotape of him walking the police through the crime scene were entered as evidence. The jury deliberated for 3 hours, and he was found guilty. Jeremy's mother, Lorelei, testified, and she asked the jury not to sentence Ricky to death. She didn't forgive him, but she thought he was a broken man who deserved mercy. Despite her request, in September 1994, Ricky was sentenced to die via lethal injection. 4 years later, in April 1998, a famous anti-death penalty attorney filed an appeal on Ricky's behalf. The appeal argued that there were several problems with Ricky's trial. The Third Circuit Court of Appeals did find one of the arguments to be valid. Ricky, who was white, was convicted by an all-white jury. Ricky's lawyer thought the jury should have had one non-white person. The Third Circuit Court of Appeals agreed, and in 2001, Ricky's conviction and sentence were overturned, and a new trial was ordered. Ricky went to trial again for first-degree murder in May 2003. Once again, he pleaded not guilty, and not guilty by reason of insanity. The result of this trial was that Ricky was acquitted of first-degree murder, but he was convicted of the lesser charge of second-degree murder. This time, he was given a life sentence of hard labor. A year after his conviction, his lawyer filed an appeal. During his second trial, in May 2003, the judge was not present during parts of the voir dire process and the closing arguments. The judge also cut the defense's closing arguments short. As a result of the appeal, in May 2007, Ricky's second-degree murder conviction was quashed. In November 2009, he went to trial for a third time for the murder of Jeremy Guillory. Since he had already been acquitted of first-degree murder, this time he was only facing charges of second-degree murder. He was once again found guilty, and he was again sentenced to life in prison. Once again, his lawyer filed an appeal. This time, the appeal argued that since Ricky had been acquitted of first-degree murder in 2003, he should not have faced trial on any charge that requires proof of specific intent to kill. That means since he was acquitted of first-degree murder, he should not have been prosecuted for second-degree murder because that was a violation of double jeopardy. The judges on the Third Circuit Court of Appeal agreed with the argument, and Ricky's second-degree murder charge was overturned in May 2018. At the time of this video, Ricky Langley is being held on bond while the state appeals. If they do not win their appeal, Ricky Langley, who is a confessed killer who was sentenced to death, will become a free man. If he ever were to be released, an FBI agent who worked on Jeremy's case vowed that he would keep an eye on him until the day one of them died. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like it. Also, please go to criminallylisted.com where you can suggest cases, buy merch, and find out about exclusive podcasts. But that is all for today. Thank you again for watching.